Okay, welcome back. We're on page 356 talking about the philosophy of how firewall rules are applied. And they are kind of like coats of paint. You know, your first layer of paint, the next layer, and so they kind of filter through or flow through the rules to see which one to apply to them. Okay, corporate firewalls are typically a little bit more complex than this. Instead of having just one thing that keeps you safe, you end up with two of these things. So instead of having an untrusted over here and a trusted over here, you have this extra zone in here, which is very appropriately called the demilitarized zone. That's actually a pretty good use because it's halfway between the good guys and the bad guys. The stuff that goes in there is like semi-trusted. You know, you can't say that it's completely trusted, and you can't say it's completely untrusted. It's some category in between. And this is the way it works. I know that my clients from the outside are going to have to send me email, and they're going to have to go to my website, and they're maybe even going to have to update, things like the DNS servers. Those things have to be exposed to the internet. But my SQL server is going to be way over here. The stuff that has all the gold mine of information, the stuff that hackers want, is not inside the DMZ. It's way over here. So they poke a hole in this firewall to allow port 25 and port 43 and port 80. So that's how that works. But after that is done, then they say they can tighten it up a little bit more and say incoming packets. So this guy is not going to allow port 80 or port 43 or port 25 because there's no need. All those things were satisfied in the middle. So this semi-trusted is the way to go. Now there's an awful lot of good technical reasons that I'm not going to get into, but just think of it this way. It's defense in depth. Think about you're building a ship, and like the Titanic, and you have a giant hull that's going to protect you from icebergs. And so you hit an iceberg. If you only had one protection, as soon as that hull was breached, the ship is going to sink. Yeah. This is like having watertight compartments inside the ship. So if they poked a hole in the outer part of the hull, the ship is not going to sink because you have additional protection. That's essentially what defense in depth is all about. You don't just have one thing standing in their way. You have multiple things standing in their way. Now, again, there's lots of other technical reasons. And, hey, come take my network security class, and we'll talk all about this. But for right now, that's kind of sort of good enough. Another way of describing this, the book does a pretty good job of describing how the DMZ works. Let's say you walk into a Walgreens style store, and you can walk up and down the aisle, right, and pick out things you want, but you can't walk behind the pharmacy counter, can you? No, because there's a firewall, which is that wall, and there's a person there, and so you walk up to the person and say, well, I'd like to get this prescription filled, and so there's some checking that has to happen to make sure that you're good. And they go back and get the medicine and hand it to you. That's exactly what a firewall does. The firewall is going to say, hey, I want to send a packet. And it goes, well, just wait a minute. Let me see if you're good and check you out. Okay. I'll go get the packet and I'll hand it to you. Okay, cool. So it's just like a drugstore. Okay. Another analogy, although I think you guys got this right. But one more analogy would be something simple like you just go to a store and you have a door that says employees only, right? That's a DMZ. It's a place where only the employees go. Okay, cool. Let's don't beat that to death. The next one on page 358 is talking about availability. So availability is basically, can I get to the stuff that I need? That's the definition of availability. So they start talking about worms and viruses because in addition to wreaking havoc on your machine, a worm and a virus could also consume a lot of resources on your machine and make it slower. And so by consuming resources, you're denying availability of your computer. Okay, I know that's kind of a stretch, but just bear with me. Okay, so worms and viruses. And there used to be an awful lot of talk about the difference between a worm and a virus. Now it's not really all that important, but I'm going to go through it anyway. So both of them are some sort of malware. I always love that term, malware. Malware that can do harm to your machine. The real difference is a virus basically takes human intervention. The human has to do something. The human has to click on that link you're not supposed to click on. You have to open that email attachment that you're not supposed to open. You have to plug in that USB thumb drive that you were not supposed to do. It takes human intervention to happen. Worms, on the other hand, doesn't take human intervention. They can go through the network and replicate on your machine and do other things. So here's a distinction. Let's say that you have your machine, okay, and you log off and walk away, and you come back the next day and there's malware on your machine. How did it get there? Virus or worm? Well, if there's nobody around, it's not going to be a virus. It's going to be a worm. So worms don't take human intervention. They can do fine by themselves. But viruses take those pesky humans. Okay, the pesky humans don't ever pay attention to what you tell them to do. Don't click on that. And they click on it anyway. Okay, so yes. And I'll admit, the distinction is not really all that important. You know, it's practically moot. I mean, from a real perspective, right? Who cares if it's a self-replicating worm or a human replicating virus? I mean, it doesn't really matter. I mean, the whole point is they both replicate and they both cause havoc on your machine. Okay, so once again, the reason why this is in the section of availability is that although the worms our virus's goal might be to steal financial data from your machine or do something, a side effect could be it's consuming resources and making your machine slower. I know, that's kind of weird. All right, so this is actually pretty tough to defend against because I mentioned to you before about, we talked about patch management. So new malware is being written like every day. Somebody's coming up with something new. And essentially, if I'm running, Norton antivirus or some other brand virus, I'm running the Microsoft one here. If I'm running that, I basically have to rely on them to provide updated virus signatures. It's a file that they send. They send a file that updates my software so that it can detect more and more viruses. Okay, so essentially, if they're being written every day, new viruses are being written every day, then I kind of sort of need my virus updates to be updated every single day. Is that the way that works? Maybe. Maybe not. And most likely it's going to be a lot less frequent than once a day to get your updates. So you're always going to be behind. That's the bottom line. Is that because new ones are being written every single day, it's practically impossible to do this. And the way it has to work, somebody has to get infected somewhere before they can detect the infection and then produce a cure. It's just like a real honest-to-God flu virus, okay? Before I can create a flu vaccine, I have to wait until someone catches the flu. I can't create a vaccine out of thin air. I have to actually wait for somebody to get the flu and then draw some of their blood and analyze how the flu affected them, and then I can create a vaccine. So bottom line is, this is a reactive thing, isn't it? I have to wait until someone gets infected by a virus before I can create an antivirus. So right off the bat, this is kind of funky. So the defense in this is just like we talked about with patching. So Microsoft sends me an update that says, man, you need to patch this. And I will tell you, there are some good stories. There was this worm called Slammer. And Microsoft discovered a vulnerability, sent out the patches. 6 months later, somebody wrote a worm called Slammer that exploited that vulnerability, and it went worldwide. Poof. Why? Because nobody patched their dang system. So when Microsoft produces patches, you better dang well install the patches. I mean, this was insane. 6 months? Shame on you. Come on. You got to do your part. So, yes, you have to patch. So antivirus software, most of them have an auto update feature, right? And they're probably turned on by default. You know, you install some piece of software, it's going to come up and say, would you like me to periodically go update? And of course the default is yes, of course I would. The problem here is they're signature based. In other words, they have to try to find a signature. Like if a virus attacks a piece of software, they can look at the piece of software and see something that, like a shadow on an x-ray. They can actually see something that lets them know that the virus is there. It's called a signature. And again, these are always reactive. I have to wait till someone gets infected before I can do the signatures. So this is another technique. And another technique is using heuristics, which means I've got an application over here that's acting kind of sort of out of ordinary. It's actually going out and collecting information within, let's say I had a calculator. And this calculator is going out and collecting personal information and hitting the network. Couldn't you say, that's not normally what calculators do for a living, so I'm going to shut this down? So that's a good way of combating a 0-day kind of a thing. You don't have to wait until your antivirus company supplies you with an update, because it's constantly looking at this heuristic-based, activity-based. So it knows what these applications are supposed to do. And if it starts doing something unexpected, it goes, wait a minute, let me check this out. So that's the only way to protect yourself against a 0 days, by this heuristics based. And then of course the one of the most important parts of viruses and worms is user training. Oh God. Telling them, and you can tell them till you're blue in the face, don't click on that attachment if you don't know who this came from. Right? You can tell them that. Doesn't mean they're going to do it. Those pesky humans are the worst problem you're going to have in security. So don't click on that is really tough to do. Okay, the next part of availability, which is the more appropriate way of thinking, is what's called a denial of service. So a denial of service is somebody somewhere is flooding the internet with packets pounding on your bank. Let's say you do bank at Wells Fargo. And so they're just beating the heck out of the website at Wells Fargo. So here you are, you're playing a game of, solitaire on your machine. You go, oh wait, man, I need to see if this check cleared. And so you fire up your browser and you go to Wells Fargo and hit the button, and it won't connect. So you have been denied service from going to your banking site because somebody somewhere got pissed at Wells Fargo and decided to basically block the access of legitimate users going to the website. So the more classic term on page 360 is, consume resources to prevent legitimate users from gaining access. Typically, we're talking about network. I mean, you could have a denial of service that happens on a PC, but that's not normal. Normally, it's of course websites and things that are through the network. So denial of service can actually be pretty doggone pesky, pretty doggone expensive. I mean, think about a retailer like Amazon who does all of its business online, right? 100% of their business is all online. How much money do they make in an hour? I don't know what the number is, but I would imagine it's pretty doggone huge. So if they were down for an hour, 2 hours a day, that could be absolutely devastating as far as the money. Or maybe not devastating, that could be a huge sum of money that they were being denied. Now, contrast that with you at home. If somebody decided to do a denial of service attack to you personally, your machine at home, it'd be like, why would they do that, right? I mean, it's just you. What's to be accomplished? So typically, home users are not normally the targets of a denial of service. Not to say that you're not affected, just that they're not directed at you. Okay, this is a good place to stop for the 15-minute mark. We'll see you again in just a few.